Nikki. Hi, everybody. So tonight we're going to be talking about the future with an amazing group of panelists, and based on this wonderful experiment that Arup ran over the last few weeks with Architizer and also in their office. And we'll talk more specifically about that in a few minutes. First, we wanted to introduce ourselves, and I'll start with me. I run Architizer.com, which is a social network for architects and the largest network for architects online. And I also am a principal in an architecture firm, Holwich Kushner. And I'm happy to see that one of our futuristic proposals that we actually built at MoMA PS1 is on this amazing graphic sheet, which we'll go into in a few minutes. And we'll also thank our graphic designer, Josh Levy, for doing an amazing job producing it. But before we get there, I hope that we can introduce ourselves and talk about some of our dreams about the future, and then we'll have a rip-roaring discussion about where we're headed.
Okay, hi, I'm Brad Samuels. I'm one of the founding partners at C2 Studio. We're a design practice based in Brooklyn with three divisions. There's design practice, and there's also a fabrication practice and a research practice. The fabrication practice is run out of a 10,000 square foot shop in the Navy Yards, and the research practice is sort of nested inside our design studio. Having a fabrication practice and the ability to build is really kind of an ethos around about how we approach design. We like to think about building as a way of designing and making as a sort of starting point. So the kind of feedback loop and workflow in our design practice often begins with one-to-one mock-ups, material testing, et cetera.
I'm Zack Costura.
Do you guys have slides? Sorry, do you have slides that go with your introductions?
We do.
Okay, let's grab the slide clicker, which is by you, Eric. Yeah. Which one? Yeah. Yes. That's me, everybody. We've covered that.
That's you, Kevin.
So we'll follow the slides. We'll follow the slides lead. So
Okay.
Kevin, why don't you tell us about yourself? And we'll just pass the clicker around as we go.
Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Kevin Finlan. I represent the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy at New York University. It's a joint research center, applied policy research center, based at the School of Law and the Wagner School of Public Service. We are an interdisciplinary research center that includes economists, social scientists, lawyers, and geographers who are all interested in studying primarily land use regulation, housing and affordable housing, housing finance, and community and economic development. We've got approximately 13 people who are focused on a range of different projects within all of those different lines of research. And we not only produce academic research, but we also provide essential data and analysis about New York City in particular, all of which is available on our website. Am I talking now about?
This is it, guys. This is when you use the slides.
I don't know if you wanted to. So when I was invited to come and talk here, I was told that this was going to be about the future of New York and of the city. And I think we were all asked to provide what we thought of as being the biggest opportunity for New York, as well as the biggest constraint. So given that I'm coming from a public policy research center, these slides are probably going to be very typical of somebody coming from that background. So the opportunity that I think of first and foremost is the fact that New York City is going to be releasing all of its public data by 2018. There is an open data portal already live, and there are a number of different data sets that have been posted, and gradually all of the different city agencies will be required to release data through this portal, assuming that everything proceeds with the new mayor. So there are a couple things that I thought about with this, and it means that we have an opportunity now to ask questions and try to answer them by analyzing this data that we normally wouldn't have been able to answer without having to go to each agency individually. It could potentially speed up the amount of time that it takes to answer essential questions that we have about our city. We had the opportunity to integrate data systems. So it means that, for instance, somebody in the Department of Homeless Services will actually be able to find out if there's something that is flagged in the Department of Buildings, or if there is somebody in the Department of Health who has been studying or has been collecting data on something else that could be of use to that person. The city right now is building this system, and they're just now testing a few prototypes, but we're very hopeful that integrated data is something that will be of great use not only to researchers but also to people in the policy sphere. And the kinds of things that you can get from integrated data would be red flag indicators. So as I mentioned, someone in homeless services might one day be able to see that there's an eviction that's happening and flagged in the system from another city agency. It would be an opportunity to streamline regulatory processes. So if you think about different costs that go into building and developing real estate, one of those costs is all of the regulation and the regulatory procedures that have to be addressed as part of any building and planning application. Right now, those take quite a bit of time, but with an integrated data system, there might be a way to streamline processes like that. And then there's also an opportunity for city agencies and the public sector to be more responsive, especially in situations of disaster like Hurricane Sandy. So in thinking about constraints that the city is facing, I think the biggest constraint, and everybody, it's no secret that New York is a very difficult city to find housing, especially if you're of low income. There are lots of problems that the city and the new mayor are going to be facing immediately. The first of these is that a lot of the subsidized housing units, and by that I mean housing that was developed through the various tax credit financing, Mitchell-Lama, et cetera. All of those are going to be expiring from the programs that had allowed them to offer units for an affordable level. The subsidies will run out at some point. That's a challenge that the next administration is going to need to address very quickly. The system of public housing in New York is under quite a lot of strain. The federal budget is cutting back, especially under sequestration. And it's no secret that NYCHA is under immense capital budget pressures. And any time that you've got a strain in finding affordable units, there's the danger that you're going to be encouraging the creation of illegal housing units and housing that is completely off of the grid with respect to regulation, which could lead to any number of particular public policy issues or problems. And also, as is also probably no secret to this group, there's quite a lot of aging infrastructure in New York City. And anytime that we have aging infrastructure or aging transport systems, et cetera, this could create other types of pressures on housing affordability overall.
This is me. You hear me? So I'm Eric Ho. I'm the co-founder of Architecture Commons. We basically advocate design for the masses, and I'm also the founder of Made in the Lower East Side, or Miles. We open storefronts to possibilities. So think of us as the Airbnb or Zipcar for storefronts. So I'm kind of in the middle of between being an architect and being a social entrepreneur, and this is sort of the path that I'm undertaking. So to me, opportunity and constraints are sometimes the same thing, but sort of look at it at different lights. To me, access is an opportunity, basically access to people's opinion, what people are thinking, how people are communicating that, and I think we have a lot more channels to touch, what people want, like Lauren. We did an event at Feast, and this is shared through Facebook, and so there's just a lot of different ways that people can communicate what they want in the city, and I think that's just going to be more and more channels of doing that, and that's an opportunity. And the flip side of that is access in terms of capital, in terms of spaces, is still dominated by the few rather than the many, and I think there are more opportunities to open and access to those, but I think that's still a major constraint going forward.
Hi, I'm Kaya Kul. I am the founder of You Are the City, an urban design and urban planning practice in Brooklyn. And at You Are the City, we do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations. Just to give you an example, one of my favorite projects I'm working on right now is a hiking trail in northern Manhattan. One thing that is sort of consistent throughout all of the projects, and also consistent with my teaching at Columbia in the urban design program, is sort of this interest in connecting design to process. I think that designers are often too removed from the political or financial processes that make their designs happen, and vice versa. And I think that making these connections, understanding what's behind getting a building built or what's behind getting a public space improvement is critical to for everyone to have a say in that and to understand what the success of a project relies on, in addition to good design. So when we were asked to put our two slides together, I thought, oh, everyone's going to talk about driverless cars and or fair, water-based transportation resiliency in the future of the city. And to create diversity, I wanted to talk about housing, not knowing that we just heard a lot about housing from Kevin. And so what I wanted to discuss and question is the status quo. The things that we, in the process, that we often take for granted or actually don't even really know enough about. So could anyone imagine that this is public housing? Probably not. Does everyone here know what, for instance, the difference between public and affordable housing is? Show of hands. Not so many, right? So public housing is owned by the government. And we haven't been building public housing in decades. There are about 179,000 units housing approximately 500,000 people, owned by or managed by NYCHA, and as we just heard, incredibly underfunded, but an enormous resource in the city. Affordable housing is what the city's been building for a couple of decades now. About 165,000 units is the promise that the mayor gave a couple of years ago, and they're on track to complete that. But affordable often then means that this is affordable for families making $100,000 or more. Not all of it, but some of that, what's considered affordable, is not affordable to what probably most of you thought is meant when we talk about this. So to connect affordability and design, I think, is a huge challenge. And the second slide I want to show is just a bunch of numbers. I'm a big fan of statistics. I think they're very powerful. And so these are a bunch of numbers that the status quo has produced. This has been in the news quite a lot lately. The current number of homeless people in the city is now 64,000. More than 20,000 of those are children. And those are people in the shelter system. Those are not the people that we commonly see with their plastic bags in the subway. These are people that move from one shelter to another almost every night. So if any one of you read the recent New Yorker article, you probably also read that in the 1960s, when they did a survey of homeless people, they found one. Can we imagine a future of New York City where homelessness is no issue anymore, where everyone has shelter? Or is the status quo, is this just something that we have accepted, that homelessness belongs to New York City? Some other numbers. So what I found quite fascinating, actually from a study that Kevin's organization released, over 50% of the rental units in New York City are somehow publicly subsidized. And so often in a conversation you would think, well, in New York, housing's so expensive and it's all these luxury developments, but we have a lot of units that already receive some government subsidies. The majority of those are rent controlled or rent stabilized. And then about, I think, 8% is public housing, and then another 8% are these affordable units that receive federal subsidies for construction or renovation. But that doesn't seem to help. So whatever the status quo, whatever the rules are that produce 50% of our housing as subsidized, still doesn't help that over half of the city's population is what's called rent burdened. That's when you pay more than 30% of your income in rent, and about 30% of those 30% of the city's renters pay more than half of their income in rent. Another drastic statistic that actually I think is a huge design opportunity, while difficult, is this NYCHA deficit. So New York City Housing Authority needs $13 billion in the next few years to upkeep their current housing stock, which is very old and in very bad shape. There's a plan to release some of the land, to build new market rate housing in order to finance this deficit. And I personally think that there's a great design opportunity in really thinking much bigger than the Housing Authority is doing now, and reinventing what public housing is with this additional private investment that they're trying to attract. Yet again, here the status quo kind of stops us from thinking bigger, and the plans that are out there right now are quite limited, and are limited to developing a corner of these lots that are all over the city that really, many of us probably think that they could be integrated much better from an urban design standpoint into the city. And then the last one, I found shocking through the course of a project that I completed recently, which was with the New York City Department for Housing Preservation and Development. This is the agency that builds affordable housing. And I don't know if anyone's ever tried to get an affordable housing unit. You have to apply for a lottery. Not many people know this. But if you find out, it's really worth doing, because the people that do apply for it, the majority of them don't qualify. So in many cases, over half, sometimes 70% of the people that are trying to get affordable housing through this process, they get weeded out because their income doesn't match the requirements. So there might be a development with 100 units, and they receive 20,000 applications, and after going through all 20,000, those 100 units are still not filled. Which again, I think there's sort of a huge inefficiency in the system, and we're not really questioning how this process works and how we could improve the process and how we could have connected to better design to create a better city. That's it. Who's next?
That's me. I'm Zack Costura. I'm a structural engineer with Arup, and Arup is a co-sponsor of tonight's event. I guess I get the distinct pleasure of introducing the company. Arup is a multidisciplinary design firm that does design and consulting across a wide range of types of projects, from buildings to infrastructure and various types of consultancy as well. It's a company that's about 11,000 strong around the world in many countries. And in the New York City area has worked a lot on the built environment, and recently has realized projects including the 2nd Avenue subway, which is ongoing, JetBlue Terminal 5 at JFK, a number of other bridge projects and transit projects. I'm, as I said, a structural engineer with the company. I've been with them for about 10 years now, working on a number of projects, different types of projects, tall, super tall buildings around the world. In New York, I've actually spent most of my time on the Fulton Street Transit Center, which is a $1.4 billion transit project that's about to come online next year down in Lower Manhattan. I'm also an adjunct professor up at GSAP as well. And I guess I'm going to jump right into my slides and maybe introduce myself a little bit just with this. These guys are in reverse order, and this one's a little bit dark, but I figured I'd start with the constraint, and the constraint and opportunity, I think, are somewhat linked. But my path to engineering was led through a very sort of intense period of fascination with Robert Moses and the development of infrastructure in New York City. And what I really got fascinated by with all of that was what I learned under that study of legacy systems. And I think we've all probably heard about legacy systems, but to me, a legacy system is any kind of system, whether it's technological or social or political, that has components that, therefore, the compatibility of which the system must remain compatible with those components. So as that system grows, it needs to make sure that it is compatible with those, and that can be a potential situation for the entire system's advancement to be held back. So, we've all been on the New York City subway. We know the countdown clocks that are going on there. That's a perfect example of a legacy system, because in order to get that system up and running, it's either all or nothing. The entire system needs to be upgraded in order for that system to come online. So legacy systems, I think, are all around us in New York City, and the city is so old that the interconnection of all of them gets very overwhelming and intense. And in the time that I was working on the Fulton Street Transit Center, we faced a lot of challenges and potential issues with the sort of technological aspects, the city's requirements, the technological requirements, the labor requirements that potentially held back the quality of that built complex. This picture here, which is a little dark, is sort of a grainy picture of some of the buildings that I've always been fascinated with. They're called the Bridge Apartments, and they're over the approach to the George Washington Bridge. And I've always kind of loved those. And just thinking about they're 32 stories, they're rentals. They were actually done under the Mitchell-Lama program, and the many millions of people that go underneath it. And to me, it kind of strikes, the idea of the need to put middle-class housing in New York City, the need to put it in an open spot, that open spot being over a highway, the legacy systems that then came into play, and that the compatibility requirements that were then there for these buildings to come into place. And there are some obvious issues that come out of it. I'm sure I don't know very many of them, but one of them that I always am fascinated by are the terraces that overlook the sort of traffic clogged arteries below it, and just thinking about how ridiculous it would be to try to sit out there and have a cup of coffee in that circumstance. But of course, the highways are a big example of Robert Moses, and his ability to push through those legacy systems, I think, is what really made him a fascinating character. And I think, in my personal opinion, after all the work that I did looking into it, my take on where it sort of becomes a bit of a villainous character is where the legacy systems that are technical start to get confused by the legacy systems that are sort of the character of the city, where we start to think of those as the same sort of obstacles that are there before. So just bringing on from that, then, of course, there's Paul Rudolph's sketches of some potential housing solutions on top of the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which, I say the opportunity here is adaptation. And I think that in the New York City environment, it's always been a laboratory for experimentation, from housing to technology to transport to politics to commerce. And I think it will continue to be that way. And I think that the legacy systems that we face are going to be constraints. And I think that the adaptability that the public has shown over the years that New York City has been here is it's very much encouraging to think that perhaps this might continue to be a laboratory to test out new things. But in order for us to do that and be able to take these adaptations on and live with them, I think we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to overcome the legacy systems that are there, that are technical and do not necessarily contribute to the fabric of the city in any sort of enjoyable way. And that also, with any sort of laboratory of experimentation, that there are going to be failures or at least successes that aren't quite as great as we thought. And we have to think about our ability to live with them or be able to accept them. And especially within the context of large projects, I feel that we put ourselves in a situation where we're not allowed to fail with large projects. And I think that if we're going to get to a city that's wildly different by 2050, I think we need to adopt a philosophy that allows us to make our experiments and come up with a way to politically and economically accept those that work and those that don't.
Brad, you want to share your slides?
Okay, so failing with large projects is actually a good segue into what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to speak briefly about a project we're working on with the Brooklyn Public Library on the future of the library. What you see here are the locations of libraries, public libraries throughout the city. And a few years ago, we began conversations with BPL about issues they're having around sort of underutilized libraries, and then in other places, underserved communities that don't have any access to public libraries. It's pretty clear that a new model needs to sort of exist, and the kind of scenario they were proposing was one of a satellite scenario. So in other words, the future library may not have stacks. It may be a place where you just order your books and then go and pick them up at this kind of storefront-like scenario. The question then becomes, what is the program if not wandering around perusing the aisles as you would traditionally? In terms of the sort of legacy scenarios that were just discussed, I think Red Hook is a kind of perfect example of a capital project, a huge library which at one point served the community and then was cut off by infrastructure, and now is sort of radically underutilized. So the question is, how do you quickly, flexibly, and with agility serve neighborhoods that are not getting access to sort of community centers and the knowledge base that libraries provide? And the scenario they're proposing, the one we're going to engage with them probably, is the idea of storefronts. How do you take a storefront, create a temporary low startup cost library, and then allow it to exist as long as it needs to in one neighborhood, and then travel to other neighborhoods? It could be a scenario where it's a modular approach to design, then literally that library travels. It could be something which is more disposable and less onerous for the New York Public Library or the BPL to sort of think about as an investment. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody. And I think we have a we have a match on our hands. I think you guys should talk afterwards. You have some storefronts, right? Yes. Okay. So since I did a terrible job of introducing why we're here, let's just take a pause. Now that we know how brilliant everyone is, let's discuss why we're here. So Arup invited architects, designers, really anyone in their network to dream of what the city of the future will be in New York in 2050. They used Architizer to pose that question, and they also had a listening booth at Arup where people could submit ideas. And this, if we could actually change the graphic to this, so that everyone can, you won't really be able to read it, but it's an amazing assemblage of varied, wild ideas, some of social innovations, technological innovations, political innovations, and economic innovations that will create the city of our dreams. And I think it's very fitting that we have such a diverse panel of people, designers, architects, and people more on the policy, economic, and planning side here to talk about this. So since you can't read it, I assume you can't read this for sure. I don't think you can read that. Yeah, okay. So I was going to read you a few of my favorites, just so that you know kind of the context that we're talking about here. The 5 Borough Express, we should build a deep subway line that simply connects all 5 boroughs. Timber, we should use timber to build cheap housing. Glulam, and it's more complicated than I really want to get into. Air scrubbing surfaces, we should coat all of our buildings with titanium nanoparticles like my firm did at Wendy, PS1, and clean the air, have buildings actively clean the environment around us. Flourishing fish, we should support ways that our waterways actually produce fish that we can eat. Surface value, that city surfaces should employ things like photovoltaic paint and energy harvesting pavement to generate power. Free range roofs, that the roofs of New York should be 50% food generating and 50% power generating. We should be composting all of our food. That's called one man's trash. Green borders, raised borders around the city, and big wind. We should be getting all of our energy from the wind. So I think it was a really interesting exercise to have you guys collect these slides and show us the future and compare them against people that were coming at it maybe with a lot less knowledge about the future, and see the dichotomy of the scale of dreams. Because I think it's interesting that architects, designers, and planners, and I'm gonna say architects from now because I'm an architect, and you guys can just put in designers, planners, landscapers, all those kinds of things. But we're frequently put in this position to be prophets of the future, I feel like. And we're all sitting here at GSAP Studio X to talk about the future. And I've boiled it down to 2 reasons why it's always us. It's because we know how to draw, so we can actually draw the future, and it can be exciting, and people can get excited about, awesome skyscrapers and spaceships and things like that. And we also talk to everyone, I think, which is evidenced by the talent that's sitting up here on the panel today. We end up as these great conductors. To build something means talking to government, to clients, to money, to end users. And it's up to us to actually prioritize things like social agenda. So I wanted to ask you guys to think like a little comedy skit I just heard Louis C.K. do, which is, he was saying that, like, all right, everyone's always complaining and bitching about flying. Like, it sucks. Forgive me if you've heard this before. I won't do it justice. It sucks. The bathrooms are small. The food is terrible. And his response is like, shut up. You're flying. Like, that's amazing. And I think I took an Uber here today. I used my phone to electronically call a car and driver, and I had a limousine pick me up, and that's amazing. So, like, pieces of the future that I never would have expected were happening, that would happen 2 years ago, are happening today. So I wanted to ask you guys, as designers, as planners, to think of the kernel that you're most excited about, that you can't believe is happening today, and how, as design professionals, we can propel that forward to create a future in 2050 that we would want. Is that a really big question? Yeah, you're shaking your head, yeah? All right.
I'm actually very excited about the future because I think I'm trained as an architect, and I think architects always are sort of in a position where we're always servicing the client, or we have almost like a backseat position to issue in a lot of ways in the way the current profession is practiced. And I think I'm kind of in a transition phase, and I think I'm in the beginning of that, of seeing how entrepreneurs always have a way to look at things differently and sort of take the value and sort of just plunge with it and be proactive about the value that they are very sort of either passionate about or create value around things. And I think to me, I think we're at a point where capital are more accessible in a lot of ways, crowdfunding, financing. Ideas, every one of these ideas could be pushed by people that are passionate about the issue, and then them pushing it forward, rather than say a century ago, like it has to come from someone with a lot of capitals. It has to come from something that is top down. Right now, there's a lot of channels and access to resources that is more democratic, that is more about pushing the value. And I think, to me, that's, to respond to your question, I think that's an exciting time that there's a lot of those kind of access that have opened up for us. And I think as architects, as you said, we have a lot of skill sets and values and sort of way of coordinating these different issues that we could become sort of that mediator between these different people. And I think for designers, if we be a bit more proactive to push our agenda, I think there would be a very bright future.
And that's what you've done at the scale of the storefront with Miles, right? Yeah. You've convinced people that they can control or impact their built environment through you as the designer, through you as
a mediator.
As a mediator, yeah. Did you want to say something?
Well, I wanted to agree with Eric. I think that at Arup, on a different scale, we see very much the same thing. And I think in New York, it goes without saying, and you said it very well as well, that most of the proposals that come out there are effectively come out because there's an economic driver for it. Someone sees an investment opportunity, and sure, if you have a large project that's going to get realized, it has to have a balanced bottom line. But that does not necessarily need to be the catalyst for it. And I know at Arup, what we've started to do is we've started to look at opportunities where instead of waiting for an RFP, wait for someone to see an investment opportunity that then gets realized in the form of an RFP that designers respond to, designers begin to start looking for opportunities to short circuit the RFP process and get in the hands of the relevant people design ideas and opportunities to improve the built environment for other reasons. And the technologies that we're talking about here are really sort of some of the aspects that are making that possible, because of course we all know from our own design practices that it's simply to compete on RFPs where you know that there's going to be a project, we scrape together the resources we can in order to make that happen. When you're starting to put together work or proposals on work that hasn't even been formulated into an RFP, it's highly risky. So efficiencies, collaboration, there's got to be a lot of use of technological medium in order to come up with a way to efficiently put together a design proposal and compellingly put it in front of the right eyes. And so we're looking for digital ways to do that.
You mean like pretty ways to do that?
Not so much pretty ways, actually. I think what we've found is that we're all deeply familiar with social media, and we know the advantages that can come from that. And actually, Arup has been internally using a number of platforms to allow people to, in a sort of a social networking style, engineers within our Arup are able to look at a particular idea and feed into that idea. So someone can create a brainstorm on a particular design opportunity, and people from all around the Arup network, all around the world, can contribute ideas and thoughts. And that can be condensed down to something that can be sent across as an idea for a design opportunity.
I wonder if, Kevin, is this the magic moment where architects can start to lead the developers to design with the power of the people behind us and social media? And right, you're turning kind of red.
And architects lead the developers. That's a really difficult question. Who can lead the developers, really? They
I suppose
lead everybody
bankers
else.
is the answer to that.
I think, who was it who said, was it Anthony Weiner who said that the mayor is a job on the real estate developer's job tree, organization chart? I think it's interesting to hear what everybody's talking about here, and what Zack was mentioning about the RFP process. I just want to change tack and say I think that academia, actually, I didn't think about it until tonight, that it's very similar to the design process, in that we respond to RFPs also. There's a particular policy question or problem, and we have to put together a proposal in the same way, but there's that same opportunity for creativity. With respect to your question about developers, I think that there's real value in trying to get ideas out there, even if they're ideas that seem a little bit wacky. I think that I would never underestimate the value of broadcasting an idea, because it does inspire people. I mean, we don't really know exactly what drives real estate developers other than a particular project, but they tend to get inspiration from lots of different places. You know, they obviously work in a very stressful environment whereby they've got to collect information about the particular capital markets, about the particular location that they might be looking to invest in. There's a lot of information gathering, and there's no reason why, design and putting these design ideas forward couldn't be part of that information they gather.
I wonder, I'd like to open it up to questions in a few moments. We have so many smart people up here, we're not going to have enough time to talk about everything. But I wanted to, Kaya, I kind of wanted to unburden you from your statistics for a second and say, dream the dream with the people that answered these questions, that were asked to ignore economics and ignore politics and project out to 2050 what it's going to look like, what the city's going to look like. And I think, without necessarily telling me how we're going to get there, are we going to still have discrete housing projects that look the way they did in the 1940s when they were built? Or in your dream, if we give you one wish, what is the answer to those problems that you listed, and what would the city look like in 2050?
Well, so I think with respect to housing, it's really about having decent housing, and like take affordable off the table. Let's assume we all just have housing. We don't actually have to pay for it by 2050. But we all have a very comfortable way of living, have shelter, have space for our families, have space for recreation, and we stop competing for this housing. We just have high quality, well-designed housing for everyone. And that, I think, is what should be our goal always, to strive for that, right? And I kind of feel like a lot of these, so what I feel like the status quo is that there are a lot of rules in place that, developers trying to make a lot of profit is one of them that we don't question to get to this goal, to sort of, to just look at how do we achieve living better and more comfortably in the city with so many people.
There's, just to add to that a little bit, I would say one idea that's worth thinking about is, and that's been put forward in the social science world, is that housing is really a platform for lots of different things. You can, if somebody is living in stable, well-designed housing, people are now beginning to gather data and build an argument for housing as being a platform for financial stability for families, certainly, but also health, positive public health outcomes, and lots of other things, employment, access to resources. Several factors go into people's location decisions for housing, and I think there's a lot of positive outcomes that can happen if housing is well designed and thoughtfully designed. But to speak more to what you were just saying about developers and the way that we don't necessarily question the profit motive, there are a lot of other types of developers out there, lots and lots of nonprofit developers who are working with the public sector or in public-private partnerships, and their goals are not necessarily the same as a private developer who's only going to be building one type of housing. I think that the real estate development community gets a particular kind of press in New York right now, and that's because most of the housing that people see going up is built to be luxury housing, but the reason for that really is because of the cost of construction. And selling luxury units is really one of the only ways that many of these developers can recoup the costs. And I think that the city, anybody can correct me here, but I think the city has encouraged that in thinking about the fact that we actually are not developing enough to meet the demand for the rising population. So therefore, the Bloomberg administration's tack has been to say that any kind of development is really going to help us achieve that broader goal of providing housing for people, even if right now what's going up is luxury. There's not to say that there aren't other ways that we could be building housing. So the timber idea that is up here, which is very interesting, to build wooden houses in the boroughs is one example of trying to bring down the cost of construction. Another project that a lot of people in the real estate community are watching is the Atlantic Yards affordable units that are going up. It's actually, all of the units and the apartments are being constructed in what is essentially a factory atmosphere in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and it's going to be all modular. It'll be the first modular high-rise in New York. It's very forward-thinking and risky in some ways, but that could really change the landscape for what's going to go up in New York in the future.
Very much so. I think I was going to ask you about that, and I think that paints a particular kind of future for our industry, where housing, I think, Kaya, like you were saying, becomes more of a commodity or a gift, depending on how left-wing we are. And then I think, Brad, what you're doing about creating updated public spaces, looking at paradigms that we've taken for granted for really millennia, and looking at them for almost the in-between spaces between these commodities.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I sort of had the knee-jerk response of kind of critiquing the totalizing agenda that the 2050 projection requires, right? And what's exciting to us, what's specific about this moment, is that there's never been a sort of a more productive feedback loop between design and construction. So and I don't think any of us know specifically what the projections should be, and so if you create scenarios where you can test, speculate, and fail. Most importantly, fail. BPL can't fail if they're going to do a $200 million library, but they can fail if they're going to do a storefront, right? So this is an opportunity to take risks and think about what the future of sort of an obsolete program is and how design plays a role.
Super interesting. There's this funny dichotomy happening where there's almost an advocacy for social spaces shrinking in size, or public spaces and amenities shrinking in size, and housing actually becoming sort of, you know, massive and controlled and unified in a way. I have other questions, but let me see if the audience has any questions. Guys, yes, please.
I just like to play devil's advocate for a second. Not that this is my view or anything, but I'd like to hear from each of the panelists. What's the risk of doing nothing?
What does that mean?
Well, so, you know, some of you are worried about housing, some of you are worried about transportation, some of you are worried about design, or libraries, or education. What is your perspective of if the status quo is just maintained until 2050?
The dystopian future of New York, is that what you're asking?
I can jump right in and say that one of the worrisome things about what's happening in the city right now is rising income inequality. And as Kai had mentioned, we had put out a study that explained that the rent burden on people who are moderately or severely rent burdened, meaning that they're paying 50% or more of their income for housing, is on the rise. This is a trend that we don't necessarily see changing yet. This is also a broader national problem. But income inequality is something that potentially could affect a lot of different things in New York City if it goes unchecked. Also, aging infrastructure. If we do nothing and we maintain status quo with our infrastructure as it currently stands in the city, I don't think anybody wants to revisit the kinds of damage and destruction that we saw after Hurricane Sandy. But that was a relatively mild storm event, given what could have happened if it were a Category 2 or 3 hurricane that were to hit the city. Climate models are showing us that we really do need to be concerned about the waterfront. We do need to be concerned about transit and transit resilience. We do need to be concerned about all of these units of housing that ended up getting damaged, people who were trapped on the top floors of buildings, et cetera, because there was no access to get out, or people who were ill or infirm who weren't able to take the stairs to evacuate. These are lots of different problems that I'm just rattling off, but I don't think the status quo is acceptable.
I would also say that maybe on a less dark side of this question is there would be a lost opportunity in a lot of momentum that some of us had talked about before. There's an enormous opportunity in open data that is increasing over the next years in social media, in crowdfunding and crowdsourcing, of developing ideas. So to not do anything and to not take advantage of the tools that we have just spent the past few years developing would really be a missed opportunity in actually maybe combating some of this increasing inequality by being able to use these tools to sort of spread power and funding and sources in a different way.
I guess I'll speak as, from perspective of a design profession, because it's a really huge question. And I think what would happen is we'll just become obsolete. Like if we don't do anything, we don't go onto Facebook, we don't know what's happening, we don't read the news, our profession as a whole would just lack. And, we don't know what's going on outside of our profession, and we just lag behind and we become obsolete.
Do you guys want to respond?
I mean, I think the doing nothing means being confronted with the kind of institutional failure that these architecture represents, which is, archiving of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge will persist somehow, it'll find a place, but why not rethink and reinvent sort of the public good, right? And the libraries is a kind of perfect place to do that.
I mean, it's been painted in dark and light. There's not too much I can add. I would maybe just contextualize it to the location and just say that, New York City has had such a history of bold vision. You think about the Erie Canal by DeWitt Clinton and his designers, and how competing with New Orleans and other seaside cities in order to gain the market share that was necessary in order to keep the economic engine going would have led to a number of incremental changes, but to dig a ditch all the way to the Great Lakes in order to open up the entire Midwest and bring all of America's goods and commerce all the way back to New York. This is probably more so than anywhere else a place where the next step is not incremental but is big and bold. And I think that the consequence of not doing it here is it may not get done anywhere.
Just building off of your comments and also thinking about the recent water tunnel that was finished. It's like a 30 or 40 year project. Went all through the 70s and 80s through really bad times in New York. But it was begun with the vision of we need a redundant water system. We need to think about the future. And it took a long time, but now it's finished, and the city's better for it. I mean, 30, 40 years from now, we're going to be 2050. What big things like that need to begin today?
Took my question.
Yeah, it's a big question. So on the one hand, I think we're in a climate right now where I would disagree. I don't think we do big things right now, but compared to the water tunnel or the subway system, any infrastructure that we have, significant infrastructure that we have in the city, that were all created at a time where the city was much smaller than the system was built for. I would say making the city resilient or prepared for climate change and sea level rise is the big project that we need to start to not be underwater in 2050. And whether that is one big project or sort of incremental, like little pieces here and there, is I think something that a lot of designers are currently involved in figuring out.
I heard somebody mumble power grid in the audience, but I would say that's actually a major opportunity that a lot of people are now looking into. One of the biggest difficulties that people faced after Hurricane Sandy was the loss of power, obviously, and places like Hoboken, New Jersey, completely inundated, lost power. The mayor of Hoboken is actually pursuing creating a microgrid solution for Hoboken, meaning that the distribution of power will be different from what is currently there. There are lots of different types of options that engineers are looking into with regard to power distribution. Some larger buildings now are being constructed with cogeneration or cogen in order to help allay any concerns that might be had for a client, say, a large investment bank that's concerned about its operations. A lot of those buildings downtown ended up having to move operations off-site after Hurricane Sandy, but there's some hope that if buildings are generating their own power, that some of that won't be necessary, and people will be able to continue working.
I mean, maybe to pose this question to you both, who are experts on housing, I mean, it seems like there's a huge disjuncture between housing stock in certain parts of the city and the contemporary demographics, right? And this seems like a question. I'm thinking of Queens with your single-family detached residences, which are places where most of the illegal conversions are happening. How do you address that kind of across the board in a large way?
Oh, addressing illegal conversions? I think I would go back to my first slide on open data. One project that we're looking at doing is trying to quantify and count illegal housing units. One big problem there, before you can even begin to think about a policy solution, is you have to be able to count. You have to know the size of the problem. You have to know where the problem is. And there are a few ways that we've been thinking about ways of doing that in order to map it, in order to track it. One example might be looking at power and upticks in power that's used at a particular residence. Obtaining data on power could lead to an understanding that maybe there are additional people that have moved into the residence somewhere. So that's that's just one idea, but would say the first thing that we have to do is count them.
I kind of expected to have a conversation about hovering cars and like 2-mile-high skyscrapers today. And I think that's actually, when you actually sit down and talk about the future, a lot of these solutions and dreams aren't necessarily the sexy ones, but the very necessary ones. And I think that that's what puts us into such a powerful position as designers, that we're able to collate this information, process it, and actually spit it out into something consumable by a broad public. And getting back to Eric's point, I think none of this will happen unless we expand the conversation and use the new tools at our disposal to drive public awareness and public demand for action on these things. And that takes a savvy combination of sexy pictures with big data backing it up and smart solutions for housing. And I think these types of conversations and this sort of experiment that Arup ran over the last few weeks with us are a really important exercise for our profession to be a part in. So I wanted to wrap it up, and let's all have a beer and talk about the future and have some chips and talk about the future. But I definitely wanted to thank Studio X and GSAP, Arup, and all of our panelists. Thank you everybody. Let's have a good night.